conversation about something like this. So thank you all for being here today. Just to briefly introduce to you, Hannah Arendt is many things: historian, philosopher, political thinker, writer. She was born into a Jewish family in 1906, studied philosophy, and was an activist throughout the time in her region in different capacities. Um, After spending about a little more than a week in jail, she fled Nazi Germany, and over about 9 years, she then 9 years later she made her way to New York by 1941. At that time, civil liberties in Nazi Germany was completely suspended, and as we all know, grave atrocities against the Jewish people were being committed there. Although she herself refused to identify as a philosopher, she's in her words, she said goodbye to philosophy for good. She said that her profession, if it can be spoken of, she's a political thinker. And she said that her work was to think, understand, and engage with the knowledge of the conditions under which political action takes place, oppression takes place, and that's what she said. And she said that philosophy is usually not a personal affair, and therefore, I'm a political thinker. Hannah Arendt is well known for her intellectual contributions to talking about the regime of the authoritarian totalitarian regime in Nazi Germany, as well as different periods in time, and her work covers a much wider range of topics, which we will get into today. Her best known works are The Origins of Totalitarianism, Men in Dark Times, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and The Human Condition. There are many more essays, there are many more collected works where she's contributed very exhaustively to the discourse around what leads one person to do evil things, or what is power, what is violence, and she contributed immensely throughout her time. She studied, today we have Daniel Ilam with us, who has kindly agreed to speak to us along with Arvind Narayan, on how we can read into Hannah Arendt in today's times, why we should be reading Hannah Arendt's ideas in times like today's. Daniel writes about activism, anti-colonial revolutionaries, anti-racist thinkers, third world solidarity, anti-apartheid movements, AIDS activism. He's written on Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Emma Goldman, among other figures. He's the author of World Literature for the Wretched of the Earth, Anti-Colonial Aesthetics, Post-Colonial Politics, and Impossible and Necessary, which is his latest book. Yeah, he's also an assistant professor in Department of Comparative Literature in the University of Hong Kong. I just want to ask Arvind if he wants to add anything more to the introduction so people know him a little better.
Oh, no, just the only point is that if you look at the cover of the book, there is Bhagat Singh, Gandhi, Ambedkar, and Lala Hardayar on the cover. And what is interesting and unique about the book is looks at the reading practices of each of these figures. So there's a way in which he's looking at a very interesting concept of how there's a way in which there are inspirations which figures draw from across boundaries. And these are, we're talking about much earlier points in time. How Bhagat Singh is inspired by Emma Goldman, and how Gandhi, of course, is inspired by Thoreau, Ambedkar again inspired by Dewey. So there's a way in which you see the world is involved in the making of, say, Indian revolutionary thought. So I think that's a very nice corrective to current models when we think of things so narrowly as within smaller and smaller spheres. Here's an invitation to think more broadly, and particularly to us in India, it's a lovely invitation because we often tend to think within our own narrow confines. So I think just thanks to Daniel for coming in on this particular point, and he had come in on a previous interaction, in fact in ALF, on Bhagat Singh and Bhagat Singh's reading practice, where he had done a very interesting analysis of again a question which very few of us have asked when we know so much about Bhagat Singh is what was Bhagat Singh reading, and why was he reading who he was reading? And he's done a very, very interesting paper on that, which I think part of that is in this book as well. That's my introduction.
Thank you for that. almost all of you know Arvind, but I'll do a brief introduction of Arvind too. He's a lawyer, activist, researcher. He's been closely working with the LGBT rights movement since decades now, and he's been a human rights lawyer who was one of the co-founding members of this very space. He's also an active member of the People's Union for Civil Liberties. He's currently the state president of PUCL Karnataka. His latest book, India's Undeclared Emergency, reflects a lot of Arendt's frameworks to look at the authoritarian regime in India. And he delves, of course, in the book deep into the abuse and weaponizing of the law, suppression of dissent, and he also reflects on the emergency that took place in 1975 and sort of lays down a path forward for us to continue the struggle for human rights. With that, I'll begin. My first question is for Daniel. Could you tell us a little more about who was Hannah Arendt and how did her intellectual contributions and engagement reflect in her personal life trajectory? Or was it the other way around? How did her personal life trajectory influence her work?
Sure. I mean, thank you so much, Ashwin. Thank you, and thank you everyone for showing up. This is to be clear, to be upfront. This is I want this to be a conversation, not least because, mostly because actually, I am still in the process of figuring out what to do with Arendt. In other words, how to think Arendt in the present. That's been my project. I want to be open about that. I have no answers, and I have the only questions, and I mean that quite seriously. So I hope this is a conversation. And for me, there's two. I guess I'll start maybe if I start by how I arrived at Arendt.
Yes.
I mean, recently. So as Arvind very generously put it, my book was about revolutionary anti-colonial thought. This idea that one becomes a reader as a way of avoiding being an author. Authors being the authorities of the British Empire, authors being the authorities of the British literary canon that was kind of placed upon India during the British Raj. And so one reads because one wants to avoid being a writer. One practices critique because one wants to avoid being an author. And so this kind of notion, this relationship between anti-authoritarianism, anti-colonialism, and anti-author, a kind of dispensation which refuses the expertise and mastery that an author would carry with it. Am I speaking loud enough? Yeah, and I also realized. I also realized that I have a thick accent and I speak very fast to cover the accent, which is a combination that is particularly bad. So I also, please wave your hand if I begin to go off the rails and hurtling along at 500 kilometers an hour. Thank you so much. So it's in this context that, in this context of thinking revolutionary thought, trying to find other models of revolutionary activism and revolutionary dispensations, revolutionary orientations, revolutionary ways of being in the world, that I turned in the first instance to Bhagat Singh, to Lala Hardayal, to Ambedkar, to Gandhi as well. But as you can, if you know the work of someone like Aditya Troy Kumar, they're contemporaneous in some fundamental way with the Frankfurt School. Walter Benjamin and Bhagat Singh are contemporaries. Eric Auerbach and Gandhi are contemporaries. So these are and Hannah Arendt is a little later, but still very much inheriting that tradition of revolutionary thought at a moment where it seems like the world is to end without. In other words, the post-colonial world that we want, the post-colonial world that we must demand, the post-fascist world that we want, the post-fascist world that we demand, is from the vantage point of the 1920s a pretty remote possibility. It seems more likely that we will die before the world is without fascism, before the world was without colonial rule. We still live in a world that is very governed by logics of fascism and colonialism. It will outlive us. What do we do as a revolutionary practice to take care of ourselves, to take care of our comrades, to take care of our friends, without kind of holding out the only hope for the future being the one in a successfully post-colonial, successfully post-fascist world. We have to survive in this moment now. We also have to continue to demand that world. Obviously, it's not a relinquishment. It's not a giving up on the post-colonial, the post-fascist world. But it's a way of thinking about both that world to come and about how one takes care of friends in the present. I think Hannah Arendt is it's one thing to say that these are contemporaneous thinkers. Hannah Arendt is someone who, by way of thinking revolution, really is thinking, and by way of thinking fascism, totalitarianism, is someone who is really trying to carry this legacy forward in the moment that is the moment that I'm working on now. So it's in this post-47 moment, this moment where the world that we have gotten is India is now independent. The world is now without the Nazis. This is the world that we were demanding, and we got it technically, but it's not quite. It's not. It only sort of vaguely resembles the world that we really wanted. We wanted a world without fascists. We wanted a world without colonialists, and what we got was sort of independence, and the Nazis are gone, right? And Arendt is a thinker of this moment of disappointment and what revolution looks like, as but also a kind of relentless optimism that nevertheless pushes past the sense of disappointment, given that the disparity between the world that we asked for and what we got, and the world that we have been demanding. I think this is so. That's a long preamble. I think she's someone. Hannah Arendt, I think, is, and this is someone for whom the Holocaust is the origin of her thought, and that's not that's this sort of historical fact of her life. Right? She is someone who escaped, who survived the Holocaust. She is someone for whom an identity of Jewishness was forced in a kind of death-free way upon her. She's someone who lived in the U.S. in the aftermath of the Holocaust, but not in the aftermath by any means of anti-Semitism. And she's someone who spent her entire life after World War II trying to figure out the question that was sort of on everyone's minds, which was, can this happen again? So you have the social scientists of the 1950s, especially in the U.S., saying, "Oh no, Americans will not, couldn't possibly be fascists because they believe in freedom or something." And you have these social scientists proving over and over again that Americans completely will make excellent fascists if given the chance. You have Adorno, who fled Germany with Arendt. They fled together, writing about the ways that Los Angeles and the cultural industry encourages fascism. Capitalism encourages fascism. And you have Arendt who takes a slightly different approach by thinking about what it means to inhabit, what it means. I really like the way you put it in your introduction. What are the conditions that humans make politics, and what conditions lead to what politics? And I think she's doing both. She's looking both forward in the sense that she's a political thinker about establishing conditions. She's a historian in many ways. She's looking back at the Holocaust, at a long tradition of republicanism and democracy and democratic thought. And she's interested in what are the conditions that will lead us once more to the horrors of fascism, to the horrors of colonialism. And she thinks both. I think that's what's exciting about her work. And then finally, the possibilities of revolution. What does revolution mean? How might we bring it about? What are the kind of things what are the pitfalls? What are the dangers of revolution if we don't think it through? And I think that's why we could be back to her, in a way, trying to think of her and Baker. I think especially thinking them together as thinkers who are both political thinkers, facing a constitution which has been chipped away, and so it's a moment of disappointment, but also a moment of still holding on to a vibrant revolutionary tradition, thinking politics as what it should be, what it can be, from what it is and what it has been.
Arvind, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just a couple of lines to add to what you already just said, which is the why I think she's such a fascinating thinker, such an important thinker, is, as you rightly put it, she's thinking in the context or with the background of the Holocaust. And you're making the point that you're making the linkage in some ways to Ambedkar, and Ambedkar is also a thinker who's thinking in the context of the oppression of caste. So there's a way in which the thinking emerges as almost a response to a concrete kind of a situation of almost unbearable horror or almost unbearable pain, and that's the context in which their work emerges. So there's something very powerful about that when you think of that compared to, say, maybe other thinkers, maybe think of Kant, maybe think of Hegel, other thinkers whose life might have been slightly more secluded within Ivory Towers, but her life was not that. It was a life which was totally committed to thought and thinking, but a life which has lived in the background of the Holocaust, where the most unthinkable things actually happen. So that's, I think, the relevance which you captured. That's one point. But maybe the other point is, regardless of what the personal context may have been, the relevance of her work is always when it speaks to your contemporary. And I think that's what matters the most, as far as I'm concerned, at least. Where I find that her work, in particular, I think three works which we can potentially talk about. There's lots to talk about, of course. Is of course, the origins of totalitarianism, then the Men in Dark Times, and third is Eichmann in Jerusalem. All three which are very significant and very, very important as a way for us to try and make sense of our contemporaries. So I think that's the impetus which her work gives me, and say why you'd say you'd want to read her work or go back to her work and think about it. And maybe I'll just take up a little bit on the origins of totalitarianism. There's it's a very, very good book actually by someone called Elizabeth Ruel Young, who was her student, and was the only one to have done a PhD under her. Has written a biography of Arendt called For Love of the World, and she's also done a very beautiful book called Why Arendt Matters, right? And that, I think, is a great kind of introduction. Again, the way I see it, it's a great introduction into actually reading this work. So Ruel Young makes this point on the origins of totalitarianism. She says that if you're looking at a work of political philosophy in the second half of the 21st century, maybe the most critical and the most important work is Origins of Totalitarianism. But she says the problem, of course, is everybody cites it, but nobody's read it. And that's the big tragedy, right? And so the difficult task which is called upon all of us is saying that, you spend your time reading this undoubtedly fat book because it has many insights in it. Again, she puts it beautifully. She says, again, why read Arendt? The point she makes on that is this, right? She says, if you look at this book, it's like a vast 20th century Guernica, right? And she says that even footnotes in this book have more insights than entire volumes written on the origins of totalitarianism, right? So that gives you an inkling of why you might want to, again, read this book. There's lots more we can say about the book, but I think I'll just hold on for a minute.
That's the next question
Okay.
to talk a little bit, because I don't know how many of us have read the book. And there are some things that do stand out when she says, the subject of a totalitarian rule is not a convinced Nazi person or a Bolshevik, but a person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction and true and false doesn't exist anymore. And there are many such ideas that she puts forth, and I want to invite you to talk about the book a little more, to talk about why is it important for us to read today, and if you could just talk about some of these ideas that stand out for you.
Yeah, I think, again, it's more an invitation. See, I'm not an Arendt scholar, right? So I'm just somebody who finds the book very, very, very useful. So the invitation to read it, I'm sure you'll read it very differently from the way I read it. I'm sure Daniel, of course, will read it very differently from the way I'm reading it. But the three broad sections the book is divided into. One is the section of what she calls racism. Second is what she calls imperialism. And third is what she calls totalitarianism. And the very, very broad point is how the features of what she calls racism and the features of what she calls imperialism crystallize into this phenomenon called totalitarianism. That's where she's going, right? But I think it's useful in a sense to maybe make a couple of points, or what she describes as racism, a couple of points of what she means by imperialism, and totalitarianism, I guess we'll get into, because that's the heart of the book anyway. Right? When she refers to racism, again, her language is very powerful and her concepts are very powerful. She says racism. I mean, we often think of racism as maybe the substructure, the way we think. She says racism is not the beginning point of history, but really the end point of history. It's where you arrived at a certain way in which different ideologies is in play. And finally, racism becomes the ideology which becomes the basis to explain colonial domination. Right? So the idea that somebody is inferior, somebody is superior, you need that kind of a thinking if you're to explain colonial domination. So that's the way she sees racism. But one more point on racism is which I thought is very, very useful from my point of view, from our point of view, is when she refers to the trial of Alfred Dreyfus again, the story I think is in some ways familiar to most people, but I'll just very, very briefly mention it. Is the Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French military, and he was accused of treason within the military, and it was found out that the case goes on, but it was found out it was a false case. Right? It was a case was completely false, and he was being tried for something, an offence he had not committed. At which point, Emile Zola steps in and with the statement, which is a famous statement, "I accuse," and the idea that you can't convict an innocent man. That's the line which Zola goes on. But the point which Arendt makes is really powerful. Is that the voice of reason, which is Zola, is really overwhelmed by what she describes as the mob. The mob in terms of the people who are welded together by the ideology of racism, which says that this guy Dreyfus must suffer regardless of what happens because he is a Jew. The only reason he must suffer is because he is a Jew. Whether he has done an offense or does not done an offense doesn't matter. He is a Jew, and that's the ideology of racism, right? Which is what understanding the endpoint of humanity, which is when you say that a person is nothing other than the identity they come from, and they will live or die based just on the fact of the fact that they belong to that particular race. And she describes how, for example, the powerful point she makes is that the ideology of racism relies on what she calls as the phenomena of the mob, right? And it's not the mob, description again, is the perversion of the people, right? We often say the "we the people of India," but "we the people of India" has become a mob, right? And the mob is based on the ideology of racism. So that's the linkage that she's kind of drawing. And and she says that, and again a very powerful line. She says that the collective tyrant spread throughout the length and breadth of the country is as dangerous as a tyrant who's sitting in one particular center point, right? Meaning to say that the people, when they become a tyrant, are as dangerous, right, as the idea of an authoritarian or totalitarian ruler. And again, this links back again to the idea that how powerful is a critique of the idea of the mob and the idea of the people. And again, goes back to I think Daniel's later invocation, which is the importance of of republicanism as compared to democracy. Right? Again, there's a point we are very familiar with in this current context, where often something is justified on the basis that this is the majority. The majority has decided, but is the majority a mob? Is the majority alone enough? Is the collective tyrant spread throughout the length and breadth of the country any better than a tyrant located at one center point? Right? Those are I think, very fascinating, very, very important questions she's asking of us in this section on racism. But I'm sure you have thoughts on that, so I won't go further, because if I go on, I'll go on to the next section. So
as I was saying, it's because I'm excited. And as I was hearing you speak so clearly about what she's setting up in the chapter on anti-Semitism and race thinking, and kind of thinking back about, and your introduction was so kind of crystal clear about who Hannah Arendt was. That I think it's worth taking a moment to think about what her method is, how she does the work she does, how she thinks the way she thinks. I mean, the reason why she gets accused of being a philosopher is because she takes these categories and runs with them. She takes imperialism, she takes racism, she takes anti-Semitism, she takes totalitarianism, authoritarianism, tyranny. She takes these categories and treats them like they're philosophical terms. She defines them. She sort of in that very there's a very traditional philosophical method where you have these terms and you have case studies and blah 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 blah. So there's a reason why she gets accused of being a philosopher, unfortunately. She's also a philologist, and she's a historian. She's someone who actually, everything that she thinks is grounded in a historical in a historical project. There's no way of thinking of philosophical thought without having considered its conditions of emergence. And that means that in that sense that she's a philologist. I've been philologist, an old school historian. And maybe this is also somewhat biased. Philology is the predecessor to comparative literature, but and so I make everyone into a philologist, right? But this notion, Benjamin, who was one of her influences, said Philosophy is this desire to penetrate the object and to know it fully. Philology is the desire to understand and stand in, not simply to understand, but to stand in awe of the thing and be confounded by it. And I think that's where Hannah Arendt, that's why she wouldn't be a philosopher. Is that she takes these categories and she stands in awe of them. She's confounded by them. She's in shock. We're in shock with her. And I think that's what makes it. She's a historian. She's a philologist. She's a philosopher. But that's what makes her a political thinker. And it's those trajectories and that kind of very unique methodology that I think she has, which makes her a unique political thinker. It's worth briefly mentioning in terms of. I mean, she's also a fantastic writer. She's a fantastic writer. She writes beautifully, and she writes urgently. And I think that urgency is. She writes urgently after the fact, and so there's a reminder to say that the urgency, the emergency is not over. It is still urgent. It's still emergency. We still live in these conditions, and I think that is a force of her writing.
I think we were talking a little while before, and Daniel's point is that racism and what unites, for example, these three areas, three sections: racism, imperialism, and totalitarianism, is what the notion of superfluity, which is very, very integral to her thinking. And maybe I'll just explain a little bit of that. When she refers to imperialism, the second section, again, I only refer to a very, very small part of the racism chapter. There's a lot here, as you can see. But the imperialism chapter, the point she is making is that she's referring to Rosa Luxemburg and the idea that that the imperative of imperialism is to get more and more areas of the world under the control of capital, right? And when you're trying to get more and more areas of the world under control of capital, the way you do it is through an alliance of what she calls the capital and the mob, right? And how do we think of the capital and the mob coming together? And I think the illustration might be for those who have read it is Orwell's Burmese Days, right? Where you get the sense of again Kipling. She referenced Kipling, where she says that the poem she quotes is I can't quote the poem now, but I think it's somewhere here. If you can find it in the meantime, go to the east where men can raise a thirst. That's the language which the poem goes in, and there are no 10 commandments there, right? Everything is allowed there. That's the broad sentiment of it. So the idea where men may raise a thirst, where you can be drunk as much as you want, and there are no 10 commandments there. The law, you create your own law, right? So the idea she's putting forward is that capitalism in the UK results in this kind of a dispossession of a large number of people from the land, right? Where do these superfluous excess men and women, mainly excess men, where do the excess men land up? They land up in the colonies, and they're not just excess men. The men who are uprooted from the worlds that they inhabit. When you're uprooted from the world that you inhabit, then you're free of any sense of morality, any sense of law, any sense of limits, any sense of ethics. So you can go to the east, where everything is permitted. Right? And so if you go to the literature, you will see this Elizabeth Kolsky's book on colonial law, in colonial criminal law, right? And how the range of most awful offences were committed by white colonialists against brown people, right? Often cutting of ears, people who keep maids and servants, etc. at home, and story after story, right? I mean, our ears were cut, rape was practiced, a range of awful offences. And the point which emerges is that there's a certain kind of a respectable within the terms of colonial society, a respectable figure, and there's one who's at the not respectable end of the spectrum. And her point is imperialism allows for the respectable and not respectable white person to come together for the first time in a unity in the colonies. What are they united around? They're united around the entire question of the oppression of the brown person, right? And that's the link she makes. So she says the imperialism is a phenomenon in which you had the superfluous capital and superfluous labor coming together in the domination of brown people, right? And again, her point is imperialism is the phenomenon, racism is the ideology. Racism is what justifies imperialism. So the two are very, very closely connected. And capitalism, of course, very integral to the whole thing as well, right? And capitalism is integral because capitalism is what expels people. Again, the way she puts it is that when you talk about the mob, right? The people who are part of the mob are people who are spat out from a respectable society. They're not people who choose to leave, they're spat out from a respectable society. And they're the ones who land up to to go without any norms as far as the colonies are concerned, right? And this links up again to what she calls the phenomena of what does uprooting mean? When you're uprooted from the world that you belong in, what does it mean? Right? It means you could be alienated. It means you have no sense of ethics, morality, law, whatever you choose to call it. It means that you have no sense of belonging. It means that you're many senses frustrated. It means you are the character in Orwell's Burmese days, who can go and do what you want because the natives don't matter. Right? There's a one place where you can just let loose on all your frustrations. What are your frustrations? The frustrations come from lack of a sense of belonging in the world that you come from. Again, can be very, very important, very, very interesting in terms of understanding the phenomenon of the mob, which we confront in our contemporary context as well. So that's the broadly put, I think, the imperialism what I got. But I think you have more to say on the superfluity question.
I think she the difference between colonialism and imperialism is significant. We'll get, I guess, related to the difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And these are concepts that are devastatingly different from each other. In some ways, colonialism is a bit more obvious to see. Imperialism is this sense that, as she put it, she's quoting Cecil Rhodes, that you become jealous of the stars because they're not annexable. So you have this desire
Sorry, you become jealous of?
the stars because you can't annex them. And so you can't colonize the stars. Stars. Sorry, you cannot colonize the stars. So you become jealous of them. Imperialism is the desire to accumulate without end, an infinite accumulation. Colonialism can set its limits. Imperialism, and they work hand in hand. Imperialism sees other planets, sees the stars as threats to infinite accumulation. And so, accumulation, but not for accumulation because you want to own something. Accumulation for accumulation's sake. They become superfluity is a desire. So you want to accumulate for accumulation's sake. It cannot help but be infinite. It comes about because the bourgeoisie of a nation have sold everything they can to the nation, and they need to be able to sell. Expansion happens because the bourgeoisie reach the limits of their ability to make money and begin to aspire to make money off of anything else within concentric circles. And so colonialism does not. Colonialism, in all of its brutal and vicious and violent and unjust ways, exists in this world. Imperialism is this different force which propels colonialism, but with the desire to never stop. Right? This would be. This would bring us into the totalitarianism chapter. Are we ready to go to that chapter? Oh no.
We're ready to go there. Just one small point which I wanted to add is the other point she makes again, this entire question of what does capitalism do in terms of producing in particular people who are worldless or people who are what she describes as stateless. That's the very, very important point she's making, again so critical to every contemporary conversation we're having. Right? The idea that what the state does is produce people who don't belong anywhere, right? And so the idea of depriving people of any sense of legal identity, the idea that the nation state as a form, which says that in the state, in her description, the state in the past meant everybody who lived in that territory had a right to belong to that particular territory. The nation state, which is the product of imperialism, comes in with the idea that you only belong to the state if you belong to the nation. So the state is subordinate to the idea of the nation, the way she phrases it. And what you produce is what she calls the phenomenon of statelessness. Again, what is the phenomenon of statelessness? Again, very, very powerfully described, right? The idea that people are banished has happened in the past as well. It's not something new to say that I don't like you in my country, go to another country. Right? That's happened. But what is new as far as the statelessness phenomenon is because with the emergence of these borders, or nation-state borders. If I deprive you of your status as a citizen in my country, because of range of reciprocal obligations which are there, you might end up not being belonging to any state in any part of the world. Right? If you don't belong anywhere, what happens to you? Again, very closely linked to the entire question of totalitarianism. Because what happens, we know, is the phenomenon of camps. Right? The emergence of camps. Where are the status accommodated? Status accommodated in camps, be it the Rohingyas in Bangladesh, or be it any kind of a grouping which is deprived of their citizenship rights in camps. Again, thinking of yesterday's conversation with entire CA debates. That's the conversation we're having, right? If you're saying a grouping is not entitled to citizenship rights, what happens to that grouping? What happens to the grouping is the only place the grouping will go to are detention camps. The only place the grouping will go to is detention camps. Right? And so again, that's the consequence of the imperative of what happens as far as imperialism is concerned. And maybe one final point I just make before we dump imperialism is we're running short. Okay, then we'll dump it. Okay.
You want to say?
No. I think your next question for you.
Yeah. Okay. I want to ask you both of you to speak a little bit about Eichmann and
Totalitarianism.
Do you finish them?
That's the most important thing to say something.
Yeah, so I guess totalitarianism.
Slowly.
We're not that short on time.
I can read this in 5. I'll just read this aloud in 5 minutes. Not in this book, but in an essay called "What is Authority," which is one of my favorite essays. Second only, there's another essay which I think is beautiful called "What is Freedom," but when "What is Authority," Arendt is very invested, and then she repeats it here in a different form, and between the differences between tyranny, authoritarianism, and totalitarianism. And I think this, for me, really concretized a way. I mean, in one sense, it helped me make sense of the Third Reich in some sense, but it also it's a useful heuristic, diagnostic, I think, for the times that we live in. And I think it's actually really worth wrestling with the three types of authority and what they entail, what they will make, what they do. So tyranny is an egalitarian structure with a tyrant. So if you were to draw, I mean, if you were to draw a little diagram of tyranny, you would have a nice flat line of everyone being egalitarian, and you would have a tyrant at the top, who's kind of standing over and judging, right? If it's an authoritarian structure, you have a pyramid. The Catholic Church is an authoritarian structure, right? You have the Pope at the top, and you have functionaries all the way down, taking the orders of the authority and making sure they are enacted, right? Then you have totalitarianism, which is an onion. And an onion which eats itself. So every layer of the onion which you peel back is connected in some ways outward looking to the layer which you've just peeled. And as you destroy the onion, it destroys itself. And the power, the authority of a totalitarianism is nowhere to be found within the onion. The onion is a system which operates on its own as it's almost a mechanical process by which the onion will peel itself and eat itself until it is completely destroyed. Right? Hitler's view of the Third Reich would be, it was solved. It was the only way to end Nazism was for Hitler himself to commit suicide. He would be the final impurity to a system which demanded purity. Right? At first it was the Jews. At first it was then the communists, the homosexuals, so on. And then, right, as each layer of the onion is solved, there's the new layer of the onion becomes the external force that has to be destroyed, and until you get down to the one person remaining, who is then the impurity to the structure. Right? And Ami Césaire, around the same time, and I don't know how to the extent to which they were in conversation. Ami Césaire, in Discourse on Colonialism, says colonialism and fascism are the same. You do not need any people in any kind of real sense to run a colonial system, because once you set up a colonial structure, it will oppress on its own. It creates hierarchy. It makes people superfluous. It produces difference. It produces difference which is aimed at depression. fascism will do the exact same thing. Fascism, what he calls fascism, what Hannah Arendt calls totalitarianism, right, operate the same way. These become, once they get put into place, once you turn them on, they are machines which destroy the world. Right? So colonialism and fascism share a logic which is about total world destruction and nothing less. Right? And then we have stories of people who, the thing that saves, what is the thing that I think you said it beautifully earlier, the things that save us from total world destruction are the fact that we are people, and people are sort of unpredictable and unwieldy things. So even as these machines destroy a lot of lives, there's always still a machine that has to deal with us, and we're a little bit unpredictable and unwieldy subjects. Eichmann in Jerusalem, I think, it's one of the final books that she wrote. She started out as a series of essays for the New Yorker. She traveled to Jerusalem to report on the trial of Eichmann, who had been extradited from Argentina to Israel to stand trial for what were called crimes against the Jewish people. Eichmann was a so-called expert on the Jewish question, and was responsible for the death of many Jews, not because he actually ever saw a Jew, he actually sort of didn't, but rather because he signed paperwork that kept the trains running on time, that ensured kind of proper collaboration between communities and death camps. I mean, he was an expert, and he was an expert who loved his job, and he did his job very well. And he spoke on behalf of what Hannah Arendt calls the kind of the kind of nightmarish categorical imperative. So Kant's categorical imperative is do unto others as you would have done unto you. Eichmann's horrific, monstrous categorical imperative is do unto others as if when the Führer finds out that you have done it, he will be happy. And so you have this logic of bureaucratic management. You have this logic of bureaucracy that is this is where we get the phrase the banality of evil. The banality of evil works through very banal and bureaucratic and somewhat sort of humanless phases, and it works by way of expertise. It works by way of enjoying our jobs. It works by way of being experts in our field. When our field is perhaps the murder of millions of people, right? These are the kind of moments that she diagnoses within Eichmann. Before she didn't diagnose the trial, maybe you want to say something about how the trial works.
Yeah, no, you pulled me away from origins to Eichmann. So we'll stick with Eichmann for now, and maybe we'll come back to totalitarianism later in the conversation and discussion. Yeah. So Eichmann, I'll just make one point, only one point actually. Daniel's given you a sense of what happened. Eichmann is kidnapped from Argentina by the Israeli forces, taken to Jerusalem, and is tried in the Jerusalem district court. And is tried for the offense of crimes against the Jewish people. Again, when I say insightful, she's brilliantly insightful on the point. She has a huge problem. She says, why is Eichmann being tried for crimes against the Jewish people? He should be tried for crimes against humanity committed on the body of the Jewish people. Just one line, but I thought absolutely brilliant in terms of what it says about even what the nature of the Israeli state today. Right? So the point she's making is when you say crimes against the Jewish people, you're producing a very narrow concept of what actually happened during the Holocaust. Because what happened during the Holocaust is not only were the Jews subject to genocide, but a range of other groupings, including the Slavs, including the Gypsies, the Romas, the disabled, the homosexuals, a range of groupings. And if you produce it or reduce it, or you say even if the majority group was the Jews, you say it's only the Jews, then you're setting up a hierarchy of categories. The only category which matters is the Jews, no other category matters. And there's a problem with that, and she very presciently sees the danger in calling it crimes against the Jewish people. The second danger, which I think she sees again very, very brilliantly, is look at the development of the law on the point, right? Crimes against Jewish people is the concept which Ben Gurion comes up with. Prior to that, another Jewish man called Raphael Lemkin comes up with the term called genocide. Right? And again, it's a really brilliant book, which if you get a chance, you must read. It's called East-West Street by Philippe Sands. And Philippe Sands tells you the story of how the terms genocide and crimes against humanity come about. Again, both concepts emerge from Jewish men, right? And first off the bat, had his entire family destroyed in the in a street called in a town called Lviv, which is now in eastern Ukraine, and on a street called East West Street. And similarly, Raphael Lemkin had his entire family destroyed in the Holocaust. Again on the same street. Again, when San says East West Street, it's actually on one road in a town called Lviv. But these two concepts, which in international law we still look at, were really important, which is crimes against humanity and genocide. And the point again is, look at these concepts. The brilliance of these concepts is the open-ended categories. Right? Genocide is intended to destroy in whole and part in a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group, right? And it doesn't say Jewish group; it says any group, right? And so that okay, it doesn't say any group; it says national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. 4 kinds of group, but still it's broader than saying Jewish people. And crimes against humanity again is a much broader concept where you get in the notion of humanity in its broadest possible way. Right? So you see that and compare, for example, the again maybe Ben Gurion's very thoughtful, very thought through thing, saying that actually end of the day, as Israel, we're not concerned about the rest of the world. We're concerned with what happens to us, full stop. Right? And whereas your aspiration should be how can what you do, how can the stuff, the horrible things that you suffer become a way in which say nobody else in the world should suffer this. Again, maybe I'm jumping the gun, but there's also if you look at the flag resolution, right? In the Indian context, the flag resolution, the resolution of the Indian flag, right? The Constitutional Assembly debates, and Nehru says something very interesting. He says the Indian flag should be a symbol not of domination, but of freedom for people all over the world. Right? And again, if you think of even the Statue of Liberty, that's the aspiration. Right? The reality might be something different, but the aspiration is there. You put it in those terms, right? Whereas the Ben Gurion from the beginning narrowed it down. Right? When you narrow the legal concept, you're also narrowing the possibility which can emerge out of the entire. So then it's very very easy then for the victim to turn aggressive. For the victim to turn aggressive, which is exactly what we see in the Israeli context, right? And they have, right? The Israelis ratified the Convention Against Genocide, right? And South Africa has filed a case of genocide against Israel, right? Using the very same concept of the law, the very same atrocity which they suffer. But the point is this, right? If an atrocity happens, your point is atrocity should not happen again. That's Arendt's point. She says something new has entered the world, this concept called genocide, something new has never happened before, and that we should ensure that there is justice for anybody suffering this, and that's her way of thinking, right? Whereas Ben Gurion's way of thinking is no, it's only us. We have suffered. Nobody else has suffered. Right? So I think there's a lot to be said just on that one line of why crimes against the Jewish people and why crimes against Jewish people is a problem. So,
I think this is. She's someone. She's someone for whom the Holocaust matters, but she's someone for whom the Nakba matters. I think she was not necessarily opposed to this establishment of a Jewish state, but it was the establishment of this Jewish state on the grounds of this exclusionary, this exceptionality, this continued repeated oppression that really was the trouble. So it's not that Israel exists. It's not that Jews should have some kind of moral superiority having suffered, but it's that or that they should have learned some sort of lesson about this. But the establishment of Israel by this show trial by Ben Gurion was explicitly about establishing a nation that was willing to kill others and on others' grounds. Right? And so I think this becomes then the question that haunts her work. She is someone for whom the safety of Jews matters. That's her life. But this is not the safety of Jews. This is the destruction of. This is the willful destruction of other people.
If I could ask you to speak a little more to that, because we know that. Sorry. I wanted to just ask Daniel to speak a little more to that. Arendt was deeply engaging with the question of the Jewish woman, and also the Jewish question in Nazi Germany. She was also working closely with the politics of Zionism, responding to it, working with Zionist organizations. Although, like you said, she later wrote on the question of Israel and opposed this idea of the Jewish nation state or this foundation. Can you tell us a little more about this journey of engaging with Zionist thought and what was the position that she took later on?
I mean, so I think Raghu Khanna actually has a great Instagram post on this. I mean, I will do a butcher job to get around to it, but I mean, it is unprecedented that a group of people who have been oppressed get a different land than from the people who oppressed them. Turkey caused a genocide against the Armenians. The Armenians took part of Turkey. It is unprecedented that the Germans didn't have to give up Bavaria. I mean, to the Jews, right? Say. And so in this idea, I mean, this would be precisely how colonialism, the British can throw a dart on a map and simply move people whose lives are then determined to be superfluous, right? It's not about the protection of Jewish people in the instance that Jews are moved to Palestine. It's about the using Palestine as Israel as an alibi to continue an anti-Semitic hatred of Jews, but did not have to deal with them up front, right? And so they could, like, these are people who could have gone to, these are refugees who could have gone to the U.S., like Arendt. These are people who could have stayed in Germany and received, special protections, and Germany should have come to terms with the kind of horrors that it enacted, as opposed to sort of self-flagellating for the past 75 years. But Israel represents a continuation of a certain type of hatred of Jews that doubles down on its hatred of Arabs as well. And I think this is one of the things that Arendt notices very early on. Arendt is friends with, she's close friends with, on one hand, Heidegger, but on the other hand, Gershom Scholem, who's a brilliant thinker of what it means to live in Palestine as a Jew. And the reason and this is this very early wave of Zionism, which gets wrapped up into a kind of nasty history of Zionism, but there's a strain of Zionism which looks at Palestine and says, this is a multicultural land where people live in peace, and to occupy one doesn't occupy it, one lives there. And Gershom Scholem had the sense that was a possibility. He thought very carefully about it, and I think that there were some flaws in the way he thought about this, the ability, but some people's ability to move to some places and other people's not to be able to move anywhere. But nevertheless, I think that there's a moment in the progression of Jewish safety where it was possible to think about the establishment of a place where Jews could be safe, as opposed to a place which would be an alibi for the continued hatred of Jews, and then also Arabs. Once Israel is sort of declared by the British on the land of Palestinians, then you have, the state of Israel behaves exactly like a state. In some ways, you can't blame a state for behaving like a state. States are violent. Nation states are violent. They enact xenophobia. That's what they're about. But what it fails to consider is the legacy of the Jewish question itself, right? Which is about a certain type of diaspora, a certain type of statelessness, which is about guesthood, which is, there's a certain type of ethics that it does away with. Then the Nakba, this kind of ultimate catastrophe, the slaughtering of Palestinians, becomes its own genocide, which is not simply the kind of continuation of Israel, but the inauguration of Israel. And the continuation of the inauguration of Israel is Eichmann's sentencing to death. So death then marks an inauguration of a state, not simply the kind of usual state troubles of xenophobia, but actual death and genocide. Genocide becomes the mode of declaring statehood. And that is an extraordinarily horrific way to run a state. And it's totalitarian. It's not authoritarian. It is a state which is invested in eating the world and not stopping until that's done. And I think that's not. If that sounds like I'm kind of downplaying the suffering that's occurring in Gaza right now, the suffering in Gaza is atrocious and horrific. But it's one of the many ways that Israel will continue to operate as Israel until the world is eaten up. I think the additional value of Eichmann is the judgment. So the court hands down, Judge Landau hands down this declaration that says Eichmann is sentenced to death, which is a bit of a show trial, blah 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 blah. That was sort of a foreclosed thing that was going to happen. The reason why Eichmann is sentenced to death is because of the crimes against Jewish people. Hannah Arendt declares, thank you so much. Hannah Arendt declares her own verdict at the end, which is really a beautiful account, and it's where she also declares that Eichmann must die, and the reason why Eichmann must die is because not because he committed crimes against Jewish people, but because he refused to share the world with others. And if you refuse to
share the world with others.
If you refuse to share the world with others, you can leave. And I find that to be a really, I do not support the death penalty, but that is, that as a kind of a way of understanding the crime of genocide, this refusal to share the world with others, is a really kind of phenomenal and radical way of putting forward politics that really condemns what Israel became and didn't need to become, but did become.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Just for my last question for Arvind, for anyone who works with you, Men in Dark Times is a book that comes up pretty much every week. It's a collection of, thank you. It's a collection of her essays on writers and philosophers. Eric Lessing, Karl Jaspers, Bertolt Brecht, Walter Benjamin, Rosa Luxemburg, many of them. I want to ask Arvind to tell us a little about the book and why do you think it's important for us to keep going back? Why was it important for Arendt to chronicle the lives of these people? And what do we learn from this today?
No, we were just talking about this a little while ago. And Men in Dark Times, a series of portraits about a range of lives, as Aishwarya mentioned. Rosa Luxemburg to Isaac Dinesen, a range of other figures, Bertolt Brecht as well, and Walter Benjamin. And what is interesting about these portraits is they don't have that sense of how do you put a kind of a gossipy interest in people's lives. You're not interested in the personal or the private or that dimension of it. You're interested in the sense the public dimension of their lives. Why do their lives matter? The largest sense is when the world is concerned, and that's the question that she's asking. I think that's such a very, very important from Arendt's point of view, which is the idea that that as human beings, we're public beings. That's her fundamental point, right? I mean, the idea that that it's very important, again in the terminology, to break isolation. It's very important for us to, in a sense, to connect with other human beings, and we become human through connecting with other human beings. And why does she refer to these 9 lives or 10 lives? Why does she refer to these 9? I think the introduction puts it very well. Again, I'm going to try and say what I remember of the quotation, since I've quoted it so many times. I should remember it now. She goes something like this. She says that sometimes even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination. The illumination may not come from concepts and theories, but it often can be kindled for the lives of some people who under almost all circumstances will be able to kindle that kind of a light. But whether the light is the light of a candle or the light of the sun, only the future will tell us. So I thought, again, very powerful. Again, for us, it's very, very powerful, because if, for example, we find that today, right, we don't find a concept or a theory which is going to explain the way forward as far as all of us are concerned, then always will be the light which some people's lives will emit under almost all circumstances. And we know that, right? And we know that. And we can think of chronicling even those lives, which I think were very powerful even in the Indian context. We were just thinking, I mean, someone like in the human rights field, someone like, say, Balgopal, as a really brilliant human rights activist, is a life which is worth archiving. Someone like Sudha Bharadwaj, again, somebody whose life is an inspiration in every way, right? And I think the marvelous thing, I think at least about this country, is you can find these kind of lives everywhere. Any place you turn to, any person you speak to, you'll find somebody whose life will be like, wow, it's so incredible what people are doing. So I'm constantly inspired by, I think, the people's lives around me. I don't know if I've quite found the theory or the concept, but people's lives I find tremendously inspiring. And I think that's the reason why I keep going back to that Men in Dark Times. I think, although, I mean, being a part of the sexuality movement, we wouldn't say Men in Dark Times anymore. We'd say persons in dark times. I think of other ways of putting it, but yeah, you get the broad point.
Thank you. You want to add something to that?
No, that was
Okay. Thank you to both of you. This is something I think should have been a 2-hour session with listening to more of her ideas, and you tried to bring in so many of these ideas that have come in these 3 books. So thank you for that. We'll now open it up for question answers. We're recording this, we're live streaming this to YouTube. So if any of you are not okay with your face is coming on YouTube, you can tell me. I won't record. Yeah. Vishesh.
Just wanted to sort of put out there a question and a provocation.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, sure. We started the conversation sort of thinking about how Arendt is writing at a moment of social and moral churn in Western Europe, right? I mean, there's a seeming collapse of civilization and sort of attempts to rebuild it. And I wonder what it might mean to think of a similar contemporaneous moment in South Asia. Because seeing partition, displacement of 10 million people, 2 to 3 million people dead. And in some sense, a reckoning with that doesn't really begin to come until 30, 40 years later. And in Western Europe, with this kind of industrially mediated genocide, Arvind mentioned that the mob is a perversion of the people. But in South Asia, in some sense, the mob becomes the people. The modern nation state is built on the backs of everyone going back to daily life after this horrific violence. And I wonder what it means to think of that. For example, I was reading Shruti Kapla's book, and she says something interesting about Savarkar's theory of history and Hindutva's understanding of violence, and makes this really interesting distinction between violence that seeks to annihilate and violence that seeks to subjugate. And of course, as we've seen with Hindutva and communal violence in India, when the mob sort of obliterates that distinction. And I think that's also true of Gaza, what we're seeing now. And I wonder what it might mean to think of these two kinds of fascism side by side, right? I mean, the Nazi version, which is, in a sense, the apogee of industrial modernity and all of that. And here, the Hindutva version, which draws on this longer history of knowing the people as crowds and mobs and mobilizing them. I'm not putting that question very well, but I hope I'm putting something out.
Do you want to take multiple questions and then get back?
Okay. Yeah. Her and then Trisha.
So, in the beginning, there was this mention that Arendt is trying to write, or she's trying to use philosophy of philology as a way of processing the grief of genocide. You know what happened, and that's something I've always been struggling. How do you find the ray of optimism, even at the time in India right now? How do you write through grief? And the very fact that even when she's covering the trial, she's being objective, while still processing grief and still demanding that radical thing, that think about crime against humanity and not just about the community. It's very difficult. And she's doing that role of writing, thinking, and pushing all of us. But I don't see that happening. And even right now, so like this was 50, 60 years back. Right now, in the current Indian project of the new identity that has been created, I find it fascinating that this ray of optimism, I don't even know if it's optimism. How do you write when you're grieving? How do you be so objective? It's a man of dark times. I'm definitely going to check out the book. But what else? Because now I feel like if it happened 60 years back, it's happening again. There's a rise of fascism in India. It confuses me. Why didn't we learn? Why? And why is that there is a whole rise of a new identity which is something on similar lines of fascism? So it surprises me. So I'm just trying to figure out how did they do it, because I would like to have that optimism and still be objective and not be, drowning in that grief or so it's
Trisha and then Aditya.
Thank you. So what was very interesting to me is the idea of statelessness that you mentioned, and the comparison between what you read about the Burmese days, right? Like moving to the east and not having a sense of belonging, that bringing you into a space of losing your morals, doing whatever you want, accumulation. How does one take that into account and compare it to the idea of the fear of people on the move? And people on the move, I mean people, asylum seekers or refugees, etc. Very similar ways, sense of belonging is lost. You're in different lands. You either moved by a force or you've come for a certain reason. But the way of behaving in different lands, what are those factors, or what is the underlying ideology that continues from the idea of colonialism, and what happens when the West comes and takes over versus when people have moved out of their land or deemed stateless and are in other lands, and what kind of fear or kind of ideologies that retain. So that's the comparison I want to draw a little bit and answer.
Sorry, we have two more, Athi and Madhu. Do you want to do that in the next round or?
Yeah, I feel like some of the questions will get lost.
Sure.
I mean, even if I think there's something very thinking about Arendt writing at this moment in the 1950s and 1960s. The person, the person who's, and I mean this in the sense that they are contemporaneous, not that they should be compared to. But Bethke is someone who is writing at the same time, up till 55, 56, and it's there's a certain type of historical specificity that this world is, which is this, which I'm trying to grasp actually. That this is, and it's something about the world after 48, what Leela Gandhi and Deborah Nelson called around 1948. Right, the world has changed. It is the world we were technically asking for. There are technically no more fascists. There are technically, India is technically independent from colonial rule. There are technically no more imperialists, and that technicality is offers a certain type of optimism. But what that world, the way they think that world unfolds is one sees the distance between what we were demanding and what we got. And so that there's a disappointment, and grief is an interesting term. But I think disappointment is the pervasive kind of affect, I think, of Bethke post 1951. After he was watching his constitution get chipped away. But the disappointment in Bethke's writings on one hand are matched by this relentless optimism of Navayana Buddhism, right? And so you have this kind of really conjoined disappointment with optimism that is completely unlike anti-colonialism of the 20s, which is this kind of like, we demand utopia at all costs. We're running head first into the kind of impossibility of the utopia that we want. This is a disappointed kind of world that we've been handed, and it's a wrestling of disappointment. I think grief is actually. I think grief is absolutely there, but optimism. I don't know. I think trying to figure out what to do with it now is we haven't been. We're not yet in the world that we've technically asked for. We're still very much. We're still very much making a demand for a different world, and the world that we will receive will undoubtedly be disappointing. I think that will be the moment that we have to kind of wrestle with then. I think now is the time for a certain type of pessimistic utopianism. I think we still are in this world. Vishesh, I think that in some ways, a kind of response to your question as well. What is this moment of 1947, writing through the grief of partition, writing through the disappointment of the post-British Raj India, but nevertheless, this kind of dogged determinism to be optimistic, as the mob continues to be violent, as the partition reveals that the British don't have a monopoly on violence, even though they have a way of cutting up a map to produce it. And I think that moment of kind of political thought, that political writing, that kind of, in some ways, there's a sort of inventory taking at that moment that is really captivating to me. That's what I'm thinking. I've been trying to think about that, and I think it's so very different than the kind of anti-colonialism that precedes it, and the kind of solidarity movements that. You think of Nehru at Bandung, right? This is a man who has dreamt the world for his nation, and then at Bandung he's talking about toilets, and this is like, what a disappointment, and yet what an optimistic. He's optimistic about toilets, but it's toilets, and so you have this kind of post-colonial, post-independent disappointment and optimism mix, which is actually kind of, and I think Arendt is someone who is very much in that model of trying to think justice in the wake of realizing there's no such thing. I
get a lot of very, very good questions, and I think these are more like, I see as more conversations. Maybe you can't really have a full answer other than just say some indicative thoughts. I think Vishesh's question is a great question, right? If you say the event for Arendt was really the Holocaust, what is the event for India's concerned? It's partition. It's partition. How do we think about the partition, and how do we think with the partition as the background? One answer, perhaps, is the partition is the background of the coming to place of the Indian Constitution. So there's a way in which the Constitution is the background is really the partition. And so perhaps I'm just thinking, perhaps the text to use there, from Arendt's point of view, might be on revolution. Right? You're talking about the founding moment, and you're talking about constituting a new nation, and you're talking about setting in place new principles. And if you look from Arendt's viewpoint, I think should look at it and say that there's a certain kind of horror out of which you emerged, and from the horror you emerged, and you set in place principles which actually the guarantee of equalities for all persons are concerned. It's a kind of a coming to terms with the past in some ways by setting in place a new norm of equality. So that's one way of thinking about it. Of course, the other way of thinking about it is the collective unconscious of the Constitution, is the repressed consciousness of the Constitution, is the partition. Why is the partition not referenced? Again, this is an important question. Look at the South African preamble. South African preamble references the past. Indian Constitution does not reference the past. But then perhaps today that's a good thing if you think about it, right? If you say reference the past, what past are we going to reference in India? Are we going to go back to the times of 1525, 1526, the invasion of Babur, etc., etc.? So all these questions come up. So the founders of the movement made that wise choice to not deal with the question of history, wise or unwise, but they made the choice to not deal with the question of history. So it's again interesting conversation. We'll continue on that topic. But the second question on the mob, when you said that is the mob, different in the Indian context compared to the mob with which Arendt is referencing. Right? And perhaps again the question which I'll keep going back to is when we did this fact finding in Dakshin Karna on the Sri Ram Sena, right, and the fact of the pub attack on girls, etc. We spoke to them, and Shakur, you were there. Actually, you were there. And we spoke to them, right? And Shakur, when we were speaking to these guys, we went in there expecting monsters, right? The horrible guys who kind of beaten up these girls. That's what we went in expecting. And we spoke to them. There was the young kids, right, who were like who seem to have who feel a sense of exclusion, left out of the world, feel a sense of lack of belonging, and violence is not, you don't justify it, but you can explain. You can explain what the roots of that anger might be, right? And they just describe small things, right? Like for example, we can't go to a cafe coffee day, which everybody else can go to. We have to carry a tiffin box. They keep laughing at us as these louds. That's what we're treated as, right? So the sense again, that Arendt's description of a sense of lack of belonging, or a sense of contempt with which the elite they'll deal with the people at the bottom, right? I think that analogy still works for me at least, right? I was thinking that it's not that far off Arendt's description. So I think that still works. Again, the point is not that there will never be people who do this kind of violence, but the point is that the forces of imperialism make this from something which is on the margins to something which is part of the mainstream, something which has become so strong that you can't say no anymore. So that's, I think, the point that she's making on that question. On the question of optimism and philosophy, again, Aishwarya, the book that you have, Arendt's biography, it's called Love of the World, and what she calls Amor Mundi, right? And that's her philosophical approach. That how do you cultivate? It's not an easy point. She said it's not easy, right? You've been through the most horrific circumstances and grief, but how do you cultivate? How do you keep yourself in a space where you cultivate a certain kind of love of the world? Right? That's what she's putting forward. And where does that kind of an optimism come from? And perhaps that might link up to the last part of Origins of Totalitarianism, where she refers to three concepts, right? Loneliness, isolation, solitude, right? The sense of optimism can come from the fact that you break your sense of isolation. If you get together with other people and act in coordination with other people, then the possibility of things changing is there, and that breaks that sense of a despair which you have, which is the entire question of breaking isolation, right? And second thing, of course, is breaking the entire sense of loneliness. Again, she says loneliness is a disease of the 20th century, and perhaps it's the even bigger disease of the 21st century, where the idea that you don't feel a connection with the world anymore, and even in the middle of a crowd, you feel ultimately you have a sense of complete disconnection with people around you, right? So how do you break the sense of loneliness? Her point again is it's very, very important to engage in, even if it's chess for chess sake, it's very important. Right? So that build that connection with the world that around you, right? That's the important point that she's putting forward. And the last point, of course, is the question of solitude, which is the idea that you must be able to cultivate a certain kind of relationality to yourself. Right? You must be able to have a conversation. What she says, thinking is a silent conversation you have with yourself. Right? So how do you build that sense of that ability to connect to yourself in the deepest possible way? So there are ways in which I think you can go about cultivating what you call spirit of optimism. Okay.
Stateless.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I mean, I wanted to hear your thoughts on statelessness.
Okay. The statelessness. See again, when she wrote this, right? The idea of refugee law was not there. Right? So that's one just to put that one other new item on the table. Not to say it's an answer to the problems, but the idea of the refugee convention, the idea that you might be a refugee, you might be an asylum seeker, it doesn't mean you have no rights. Right? That doesn't mean you're going to detention camp immediately. So that's one kind of a development. The entire question of how you combat this question of statelessness. But it's not a solution for the simple reason that even till today, I mean Burma's law. I mean, you render an entire grouping without rights, and they're all in detention camps in Bangladesh as well. So it's the big problem. Statelessness is the big problem, and again she links that up to again a very very important notion. She calls it the idea of the right to have rights. Right? The idea that what is a stateless person? Sorry, who is a stateless person? Stateless person is someone who does not have the right to have rights. What does she mean by that? Again, you go back to the UDHR, it's a very important article which I never understood till I got the statelessness notion, which is right to recognition as a person before the law. Right? Again, why do you have a right to be recognized as a person before the law? Again, her point again is that in she doesn't say this, but in place of the pompous catalogue of the universal rights of man, is the modest Magna Carta of a workers' charter. Right? So the idea that your rights in a sense are dependent upon a state. That's the world we live in. Right? International law will not be able to guarantee the rights which a national legal framework can. So the idea of belonging to a nation state is so important because that's your right to have rights. If you don't belong to a nation state, then you can be killed and nobody can kill. That's the thing. If you belong to a nation state, then you'll be put in prison. But that's still, she's making a fine distinction, right? Being in prison is any day better than being in a concentration camp. Right? And that's the line she keeps drawing. Again, this very difficult distinction she draws. We're having this debate between slavery, forced labor, and being in a camp. Right? What are the hierarchies of these three states? Forced labor, end of the day, is you have to perform labor for a certain period of time. Slavery, end of the day, however bad it may be, the slave's life is valuable. It's property. End of the day, your property, I'm not going to kill my property as and when I want to, because I need my property to reproduce. I want my property to grow. I want my property to good health so I can keep delivering for me. But as far as the camp is concerned, she says that's a phenomenon of the superfluousness. People there don't exist. Right? It doesn't matter. You can do with them what you want. So again, that's the important point. Right? I mean, when we have camps, it means people don't matter. That's the important new concept we're introducing, the superfluity of human beings who are stateless.
I do not. I'm troubled by her notion of what slavery. I mean, what she thinks slavery is. I think slavery is not. I see what she's getting at. She's getting at an important. She's getting at the kind of value of a human life as she's missing the value as a commodity value, not a human value. And I'm worried that I think is a really serious oversight on her part. She was great about thinking about race, but she was awful about thinking about blackness. She was great about thinking about revolution, but she was bad about thinking about Fanon. I think she misses a key element of the atrocity of slavery, which is in fact that is not a life; it's a commodity. A person has been rendered a commodity. A person has been rendered an object. And I take the point. I take how she's getting to a point that she's making. But I think I think she's completely wrong about slavery. And I think going back, one of the things that your question brought to mind was the statelessness that's being produced right now with climate change. That people have become stateless because they have no land. It's been flooded. It's uninhabitable, right? It's drought, and so a certain type of a new level of anthropocenic statelessness is being produced. Where these are not refugees; these are people whose passport no longer matters because that nation doesn't exist because it's uninhabitable. And I think that will be that wave of superfluity, which is produced the exact same way. This infinite desire for expansion, infinite desire for accumulation, which is destroying the earth, right? Is continuing to produce people who are superfluous, not by way of the same logics of totalitarianism, though the effect is the same. The people who not have a state because the state is underwater or it's dry to the point of unlivability. And I think that's one of the things that your question brought to mind was in this kind of new level, a sort of geologic the world level of what statelessness will look like as we go forward.
Okay. We have 3 more questions. We have Atri, Bindu, and Madhu. We'll take 4 more. No, it's 8:30. Maybe we can stretch it. Yeah, let's take 4 more questions.
Thank you so much, both of you, for such an enriching discussion. I have a question specifically for Daniel, but first I have a comment. As Arvind was speaking, I was taking furious notes, and I was thinking this discussion about infinite accumulation and has a corollary, as a kind of parallel, as a kind of related undertone, which is that capital is spreading its tentacles through this process of expanding imperialism across the 19th and the 20th century. There's also a parallel undertone of capital that's going in, where I've written down here what is the affective regime that capital unleashes, which is, to my mind, losing ownership over one's own hate. So I get the right to hate, but I don't have to own my own hate. I don't have to take responsibility for it, which is what I have learned from, I concluded, having learned from what you said about infinite accumulation and the non-belonging kind of people who don't have to, who participate in riots or genocides or whatever, because they don't have to own their hate. So I've written down here loss of ownership over violence, loss of ownership over hate, and loss of ownership over one's own story. If I have a story to tell, then I love myself a little bit more. But if my story gets disrupted constantly, then I guess hate is easier to participate in. And that is the kind of non-owned hatred that I think Arendt gives a very good explanation for. I would infuse it with 20th century Marxism, especially of the Benjamin variety, where there's a kind of generalized kind of dystopia which makes certain kinds of horrific acts all right because you don't have to participate in them fully. There's a division of labor, right? So I press this button and that bomb goes out. So somewhere it's okay. I just press a button. I didn't actually fire a gun, so I'm okay. And the question, so I've written down here, there's a certain kind of group dynamics of the 20th century that we get in countries like India and elsewhere, which is groups make people mad. Something about, and I'm not necessarily against group identity. There's something about group collective dynamics breeds a kind of madness which is bred by capital. And the question for Daniel is that having known Arendt's friendship with Benjamin, how does Arendt take to the question of God? I don't see a mention of Messianicity anywhere in Arendt's writing so far as I know it. And can you speak to that question, please? Thanks.
Bindu?
So my question was about right to have rights, but that's been answered already.
Okay, cool. Madhu?
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. I think for lazy readers like me, who don't interesting, I think this was really useful because Arendt is always somebody who's inspired and because of her engagement with the kind of the horror of Holocaust and the way that she tried to
You should speak loudly.
I'm not saying anything great. So I'm going to ask you a question. I haven't yet got the question. So yeah. So basically, it's nothing. I just wanted to. I wasn't sure whether I understood what you said because I was looking forward to listening to more when she asked the question about what was Arendt's engagement with the Nakba. You started on it. So I would like to understand how did she she must have been conflicted. She was writing through grief, as she was saying, about what was happening, and yet she was trying to seek the brightness. She was trying to seek, she has relentless optimism of the spirit. So she was dealing with all of this. Okay. So in that, how did she engage with the Nakba, and did she foresee, what she was talking about in terms of totalitarianism and all? Did she foresee something like that happening in the state of Israel? Was she able to see? I've not read about it, so since both of you have,
Okay.
I would like to understand.
There's just one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, So I was asking, like, on one hand we have totalitarianism, and then on the other we are saying how in the entire structure of capitalism, how Noam Chomsky and Herman has said that hegemonically the consent is being won over, and a certain mass or majority of people are being homogenized. So is there a difference or is there a shift between both the structures of how people in power are sort of controlling the masses to think in a homogenized way against a particular community, be it like Nazi Germany thinking against Jewish communities, or today what we are seeing in Gaza?
We see more about that. I mean, we see more about that. Like, I worry that I worry that the kind of the hatred, this ownership of hatred, or this avowal of hatred, which is still hatred, is coming from above. It's also coming from below. I mean, there's not a tyranny of genocidal thought. There's also an egalitarianism of genocidal thought, and that's. I guess.
Yeah, so I was saying that on one hand we have totalitarianism, where the power structures are sort of oppressing the people, but certain masses of the people are also like, it's fine, we will be oppressed. They're giving the consent. And then on the other hand, we have capitalistic structures where we are seeing that the consent is sort of being manufactured. Like the people are not directly being told what to do, but then they are behaving according to what the people in the power are saying them to do.
Again, I think this is an interesting question because I think I am, in some ways, I think that the people have more are frightfully smarter than being told what to do. I think the hatred, the genocidal hatred, is in some ways organic. You're absolutely right to say that it has a kind of production from the top down. But I think what we're seeing in Gaza, what we're seeing with kind of RSS. Is a grassroots hatred, is a grassroots xenophobia that's being stoked absolutely by policy, by leaders, and by media, yeah, absolutely. But what seems, I mean, we watch the videos from the Israeli protesters who really won't let the news end in Gaza. I mean, these are people who have a very robust and quite rich theory of how much they hate someone. And I mean, it's a phenomenally dense and rich philosophy of genocidal, bloodthirsty hate. And they don't need. It doesn't seem, in some ways, what's so horrifying about it is that it doesn't seem like they need anybody to help them out. They've cultivated that horrific theory on their own. I mean, this is in some ways what this is what the final stage of totalitarianism is that you can do it yourself, and you do it yourself on yourself, as you in a murderous, genocidal, xenophobic, totally destructive way. So I think one of the things that, especially coming out of Gaza, is watching Israelis on being interviewed, having these, the children signing the bombs, or the soldiers rifling through women's underwear after they destroyed the woman's home. These are grassroots theories of hatred, and grassroots theories of dehumanization that are frightfully rich and complex, and the theories of how one dehumanizes another, and they're horrific. I don't know if who could predict Gaza? Or perhaps we all could have predicted Gaza, and in some ways both are true. I think the Nakba, Nakba obviously, in retrospect, is as the inauguration of the Israeli state foretells a continuation of a state which will enact genocide and murder, for expansionist reasons, for infinite expansion. This is its logic. I don't know. I think Hannah Arendt saw. I don't know if she was thinking in terms of predicting, imagining the future, but I think she saw an inauspicious beginning, and an inauspicious beginning from a horrific tragedy, did not solve the horrific, did not solve the horrific tragedy, did not ameliorate the wounds of the tragedy of the Holocaust, but was an inauspicious beginning to a new catastrophe. I think she wasn't predicting a catastrophe. She saw the catastrophe unfold in some ways, in real time. And I have no idea actually what she thinks about God. The category of the Jew for Arendt is one that has been produced as this is long-standing tradition within Western Europe. Less so outside of Western Europe, where the Jew is a different figure. But within Western Europe, the Jew is the object of hatred, and as with Benjamin, who has this much more kind of theological messianic vision, even Benjamin doesn't have a concept of God in some sense, right? Because the Jewish God for Benjamin, for Arendt, is sort of irrelevant, because whatever he does, we have no clue what it means. He acts. We have to behave
Mysterious ways.
He acts in such in horrifying, mysterious ways. He asks us to sacrifice our son just because, and so on, and so and so so Jewish critique, I think, for Benjamin as well as for Arendt, was secular in the sense that it had to behave in a world where God didn't reveal himself. Unlike for Christians, right, God came and revealed all of the reasons why he was causing trouble in the first place was because he was setting things up for good. In the tradition of Jewish philosophy, from Maimonides to Benjamin to Arendt, the critique is inherently secular because all we can know about God is that we know nothing about God.
Just one small point is that on the question of Arendt and the Jewish question, the collection of writings called the Jewish writings are there, which I have not read, so I don't really have a sense of what she thought about the Nakba. I thought it's an important question. Maybe we'll go back to it and we'll have a better answer next time around.
Have you responded to everyone? Okay. Thank you all. Can we close? Is everyone okay? Thank you all for coming in. Thank you so much, Daniel and Arvind, for taking us through Hannah's ideas, and all of you for staying so late and still really engaging with the discussion. Thank you all for coming. A couple of